Hi guys, welcome back to Financing as a Freelancer. Today we're going to dive into the details of setting rates. How do you go about charging your clients for your various services that you provide, and how do you go about estimating an appropriate rate for each of the services that you provide? As a quick review, as we discussed last time on the pros and cons of being a freelancer versus being an employee, when you're a freelancer, you can't just think about the amount of time that you spend on the activity that generates you income, say teaching or writing journal articles or whatever it is that you do. As part of the cost or baked into the cost that you charge your clients, you have to think about all the non paying tasks that you do. So, for example, spending time to find clients, spending time to write the legal requirements for those clients, spending time on all your financial bookkeeping, etc. When you price your service, you have to include in the cost of your service all the additional administrative burden that you spend in order to execute that service, not just the amount of time you spend, choreographing or teaching or writing or whatever it is that you do. So, to help us figure out what that rate is going to look like, we're going to go about two methodologies of doing this. The first is I'm going to use the methodology of estimating my total cost to provide the service, and then I'll help you figure out what an appropriate rate is. And the second method we'll go through is market comparison. For market comparison, I'm only going to use the dance industry as an example because that's the only market that I am extremely familiar with. But you can do that on your own if you're part of another industry. And typically, you'll find that these two come out to a similar methodology, similar number. If they don't come out to a similar number, what that probably means is you're missing a cost that you're trying to cover, or you're overestimating the size of a cost. And that's why these two numbers don't line up with each other. So we'll go through both of these methodologies coming up with the cost for various services. If you're used to being an employee, the amount you're going to charge for each of these services is going to feel very, very high to you because you're not used to thinking of covering all these extra administrative burdens in your price for a specific service. So you're going to be kind of shocked at, oh my gosh, I should charge that much to teach a class, or I should charge that much to choreograph a piece, or that much to write, an article for a newspaper. But because you're covering all these extra costs, these numbers are going to be particularly high. And so that's the goal of this session, is to get you used to thinking about your rates like that. So we're going to dive into estimating the total cost here. In doing that, we're going to break down our costs that we spend to provide a service into 4 different categories. The first is compensation for creative time. So this is the time you spend brainstorming to write an article for a newspaper, if you're a writer. The time spent, brainstorming and choreographing a piece, if you're a choreographer, whatever that may be. Then we'll say compensation for admin time. So this is admin time specific to each client, right? So this is, for each hour or for each time I choreograph a piece, approximately how much administrative time do I spend talking with the studio owner, nailing down an agreement, or giving them an invoice, all that sort of stuff. If you're a writer, right, how much time do you spend negotiating an agreement with each of your clients, following up on invoices, making sure contracts are signed on time, so on and so forth. The next one is, I'll say, average compensation for overhead time. What I mean by this is total business overhead that is not specific to each client, but is business overhead you accrue during the year. So, for example, how much does your website cost every year? In my case, I have a high quality Dropbox account that I use to share videos with my company as well as with my customers for choreography. So how much does that cost me? I have to order a pair of tap shoes every year. Those types of overhead costs that I go throughout the year, my healthcare, my whatever, how much do those total things cost? And then you have to decide, I'm going to give 5% of that cost to each client, or 10% of that cost to each client, or some percentage of that cost is going to have to be added to this so that it compensates for those total costs that you have just for running your business, right? Even if you had no clients, what would the standard cost for running your business be? That's what we call overhead. And that's kind of what you have to think about here, is what your total overhead costs are, and then how much of that you're passing off to the client. And then last, and this is always the hardest one to estimate, is opportunity cost. So if you think about the case of a dancer, right, or a choreographer, because I'm flying to teach at a studio in Denver, that whole day or 2 days that I'm flying and teaching and flying back are days that I cannot work in New York. So what is the amount of work that I'm giving up in New York in order to come to Denver and teach? So even if I'm teaching 1 hour of class, if I'm giving up 10 hours of working in New York, and that's an opportunity cost that I'm giving up and I have to bake in to my cost of the service to fly and teach, right? Because only if I'm getting paid more to come to Denver and teach does it make sense to do that rather than just staying in New York and doing what I would normally do. So these are the 4 types of costs that you have to think about. The time you spend on creation, the time you spend on admin, the overall overhead cost of the business, and then any opportunity costs. So, for example, to give you an idea of how I think about this if I'm pricing a class, let's say a studio is asking me to teach an hour and a half class, right? So I'll say, okay, I want to make $50 an hour in my creative time. So for an hour and a half class, that'll boil to $75 total. I'll assume that for every hour that I spend teaching, there's about half an hour of admin time, so time spent talking to the studio owner, negotiating payments, whatever. This is actually light. Well, actually, let's estimate it 100%. So for every hour of time that I spend teaching, I spend an hour of time on admin. So we'll say 100% admin time, i.e. 1 hour of admin for 1 hour of teaching. So right here, we took this $50 an hour equals $75 total. So right here with 100% admin time, we've added another $75 to our rate for this class just by the admin time alone, right? So you can see how quickly the rate for the class goes up. Next, you say average compensation for overhead costs. So here, I'll just give you my approximate numbers. So I spend, I'll say, we'll call it $500 per year on overhead. 5% of this is charged to each client. That's just from the fact that I typically have about 20 clients a year, so I'm charging 5% to each of the clients, so that across all my clients, they cover my full overhead costs. So this means I'm adding about $25 to this class cost. And then last is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a bit difficult to estimate, because this is essentially saying, by flying to a studio in Colorado to teach, how much work am I giving up in New York? And this, of course, depends on the flight schedule. It depends on what time of year it is, and therefore what other work I could give up in New York. This one is kind of the hardest to estimate. Typically, what I do for this is I just increase by a percentage based on how many days that I'm out. So I try to always minimize my travel time, but instead of estimating exactly how much money I'm giving up in New York, I'll just add 20%. This is a very unusual way about going about opportunity cost. Most people think about opportunity cost by estimating how much cost they're actually giving up. But I found that this 20% number generally ends up averaging across all my clients. In some cases, I charge a bit more than I probably should have. In some cases, I charge a bit less, but it ends up averaging. So if we add this up, 75 plus 75 is $150, plus another $25 is $175. If we add an additional 20%, we're sitting somewhere just above, about $210, $215. Like I said, this class is going to feel very expensive to you, right? $215 for a 1.5 hour class. That is going to feel expensive for sure, especially compared to, if I were to teach full-time at a studio, I would get less than half of this for sure. But this is kind of how you want to think about how much a class costs you. Now, whether a studio will bite for that money is a separate question, but in terms of what you feel like is a fair compensation for your time, this is how you should be thinking about it. And then you want to work towards building yourself up so that you can charge that much for a class, so that it makes sense for the amount of cost that you're putting into in order to provide that class. So now that we've estimated how much I should charge for a class using the estimated total cost methodology, let's take a peek at market values of classes and choreography in the dance industry and see how this matches up with the market. For those of you who are not in the dance industry, this section will not be super applicable to you, but hopefully it still will be useful to look at so you can see how the market comparison kind of lines up with the total cost that I estimate and where that puts me in the market in terms of more pricey or less pricey. And therefore, you can do this market analysis on your own by talking to your colleagues, and you can use this as a way to figure out and double check that your methodology of estimating total costs is in the right ballpark. Cool. So to deal with market comparison, I'm going to divide my rates into people from 3 different backgrounds. So we'll make a table. In this first category, we will say less established. In this next category, we will say fairly established. In the final category, we will say extremely established. What I'm doing here is for the various services I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you my understanding of what people who are kind of younger and newer to the scene charge, but those who are fairly established charge, and then those who are quite successful charge. To be clear, the extremely established are those kind of qualifies in like the top 15% of their field. Those who are like absolutely like legends will charge more than those who are extremely established, meaning, Paula Abdul or someone like that is going to charge more than an extremely established person. But these are kind of the categories that I feel like are applicable to most people. Is, those who are young and have just moved to New York and have some really good momentum behind them but are less known. Those who've been around for a while and are quite established but are not, teaching at extremely well-known places or whatever. Those who've really made it to the top portions of their career, and then we'll leave out the legends for now. So, starting with a workshop class, some people call this a master class in the dance industry, but I hate using the term master class because I think the term master really should be reserved for legends. So less established dancers typically charge approximately $150 per class. A class usually being somewhere in the hour to hour and a half range. Some people charge per hour, some people charge per class. How you do that is up to you. I always charge per class because I want to incentivize people to provide me longer classes. If I'm charging per hour, then 1.5 hours is more expensive than 1 hour. And as a tap dancer, I always find that teachers are trying to cut my classes shorter. So by keeping the cost flat for a class, an hour class and an hour and a half class are the same length. And so I'm incentivizing them to pick an hour and a half class for me because at an hourly rate, it's less for them. So you can choose to do per hour, you can choose to do per class. By doing that, you're incentivizing different things, and you need to ask yourself what incentive structure you're trying to set up. For fairly established dance teachers, $250 per class for a workshop class is pretty standard. And then for extremely established teachers, I usually see about $350 a class. So when you're first starting off, say, as a workshop teacher, and the first time you're teaching in a studio that's not your home studio, this is a pretty standard number to charge. As you start to grow your career and you get fairly established, this is about where you want to charge. So you'll see this kind of lines up with what my goal is for now. And I think where I am in my career, this is probably fair to characterize me in this vertical. And then those who are extremely established, so those who teach at, like, say, break the floor conventions, or those who are like directors of really established dance companies like Harvard Street or something like that, will charge this much. And then the absolute rock stars, like I said, Paula Abdul or whoever, will obviously charge much more than this. But this kind of gives you an idea of the 3 different buckets you're in and how that'll grow. And as you can see, again, this approximately in my case lines up with my estimated total cost. So for those who are less established, they're obviously not going to get the equivalent of $50 an hour. They'll get more like the equivalent of $30 an hour. And those who are extremely established, this number is going up because they're saying, hey, I should get, say, $75 an hour or whatever, because they're more established, which makes a lot of sense, right? Someone who's extremely established, their time teaching is valued much higher than somebody who's less established. So this is approximately what you can expect. If we're thinking about solo choreography, I see something similar here. So typically for less established people, I will see approximately $300 for someone to choreograph a solo, right? You're spending custom time to choose music, and you're spending a couple hours, 4 hours or so with a kid, and then you're probably editing the music, so on and so forth. So taking into account all that time, that's approximately what you charge. Then I see this go up to about $450 a solo for like a more established choreographer, and the most established choreographers, I'll just call this 600 plus per solo. Here, the rates are a bit more variable once you kind of get higher up the chain, and this is really just dependent on how unique your artistic voice is and how much people really enjoy working with you. And it's kind of, it's always an interesting game to figure out, what you should charge for a solo and what do you feel like is fair and what do you feel like is too high. And a lot of times you'll be able to tell from feedback, right? Worst case scenario, you put out a number and, someone says, hey, we'd really like to work with you, but we can't do that. Would you be willing to come down $50 or $100 or whatever the amount is? But this at least gives you an idea of, are you charging yourself kind of fairly based off of what vertical you feel like you're falling into. Again, if these rates don't match up with your estimated time, there's one of two things. If this number is lower than the vertical that you feel like you're in, you are probably misestimating a cost here, typically either the average overhead cost or the opportunity cost. If this value is significantly higher than what the market says, then you might be overestimating how much you should be getting per hour given your experience level. So again, as a quick review, there's two ways of going about setting your rates. Estimating your total costs, in which case you estimate all 4 of these costs and add that up to get the cost of your service. And then you should also compare to your market, talk to fellow freelancers, talk to people in your industry, talk to your clients, see what they feel like is a reasonable rate. And these two things should approximately match up. If they don't approximately match up, that means either your market research is wrong or your total cost is wrong, your estimated total cost is wrong. And when these two are matching up, then that gives you kind of confidence that the rate you're charging is a reasonable rate. Hopefully this makes sense. Next time we will chat about how we go about estimating the expenses and projecting revenue for our business so that we can have a more stable expectation of our yearly income and so we can make life decisions more appropriately. Thanks so much.